Hello folks, this is Master Corporal Moore and I'm bringing you my third installment in a series of videos on Clan Wars meta tanks. This one is specifically the Tier 6 meta, and I'm going to start right into it with the heavy tanks. I'm going to split them into two groups. The first one does not include the KV-2, actually neither one of them do. However, the KV-2 does show kind of the example of what one meta might be. And that would be primarily the OI with massive amounts of armor and hit points. It has high survivability, and with a high caliber gun that fires rounds the size of other tanks, it has a high ability of killing something. Unfortunately for them, they have a very slow rate of fire and other vision range issues. But when used properly, it can be very devastating to the enemy, and even up against a strong clan, they will have a hard time defeating a heavily gunned group like this. That being said, it's not 100% successful, and you can be outplayed very easily by a group of simply lights and mediums, perhaps with an artillery support. The other half of the heavy tanks that would be the meta would be the KV-85, the M6, and the 3601. They're more of your standard heavy tanks with decent enough armor, somewhat mobility for heavy tanks, as well as decent rate of fire for their guns that are reasonable guns. So those three would be something that if you prefer to play heavies, I would recommend getting into those. However, the OI is something that you will see in Tier 6 Strongholds and Clan Wars on a regular basis. Continuing on with meta tanks, I'm going to cover off artillery. Now, unfortunately, I do not have any Tier 6 artillery meta tanks personally. I have ground through the AMX-13F3, which is considered one of the meta artillery, and I've also ground past the M44, again, one of the meta artillery. There's something that I may consider getting back in the future to have artillery available for Tier 6 Clan Wars and Strongholds. However, it's not something that I'm going to run on a regular basis, and it's really going to be when you know what the enemy is going to bring, because the artillery can be used to dig out massively entrenched teams, especially if they have OIs and so on. Now, the FE304, or the BERT, has a very high rate of fire. It has amazing mobility, but because of its short range, it's not considered one of the meta tanks. The only example I have really is the 105 French Tier 5 Premium artillery, the LEFH-18B2, or as a friend likes to call it, the leaf blower. And honestly, it does look like a leaf blower. So the next step in Tier 6 meta tanks would be TDs, and honestly, there isn't much meta in the TDs in Tier 6. Ultimately, Tier 6 falls into a couple of categories, and that would be lights and mediums, high mobility, high rate of fire, and using vision to your advantage, or heavily armored, very strong, good alpha, heavy tanks. The TDs don't really fall into that. The SU-100Y, which is my only Tier 6 TD that I currently own, is a very typical TD at Tier 6. It doesn't really shine at Tier 6. It has a great gun, but no real armor. It's very big and noticeable, so it's not hard to hit it. Also, it doesn't have much mobility, so it's not hard to flank it. So ultimately, there is not a lot I can say that's really nice about this tank, unless you can get hidden in the back and use 14 team members to spot for you. Unfortunately, in Tier 6, the limit to your team is going to be 7 players, so I can't endorse any of the non-turreted TDs. On the other hand, the Hellcat, which used to be a dominant force in Tier 6 company battles, as well as the Jackson and the Achilles, are something that you can consider in some situations if you're doing a defensive or something like that. I still personally prefer to take lights and mediums for the most part, or if you're defending and you want to use something like the OI meta, feel free to do that. But if you are going to take TDs, I would highly suggest staying with something that has some mobility, has a turret, has the ability to move and flex, and has a decent gun, such as the 3 that I mentioned. Round out the field, I'm going to run through the lights and mediums. So starting off with the lights, I will say that in Tier 6 Strongholds, pretty much any light can be used, and it's a great way to grind through your Tier 6 light tanks is in Strongholds. So you can help your clan out while you're getting the next tier of light tank, moving up towards another line. I have the VK2801 in my garage right now because I am grinding towards the RU251. However, it is not considered one of the meta tanks. The two meta tanks for Tier 6 lights are going to be the T37. It's loved for the fact that it is comparable to the Cromwells, which I'll cover off in a minute. It has a decent gun, good mobility, excellent camo value, and I believe it has the highest hit points of all the Tier 6 light tanks. The Type 64, while very susceptible to HE damage, has very few hit points. It has a decent gun, decent mobility, excellent camo value. So ultimately, these are the two tanks that I would use the most. The T37 is going to be generally used as an active scout, which is why I have coated optics and vents on mine, where the Type 64 is going to be more of a passive scout, which is why I have binoculars and a camo net. So you can see how two tanks in the same tier have completely different ways of playing the same idea. Now the next part is going to be the mediums. So some people have an argument for the Skoda T25. Now I don't have the T25 in my garage anymore. I do not agree that it is a Tier 6 meta tank. However, I've got the T40 here as an example of the Czech line. Ultimately, I find they don't have enough survivability, maneuverability to really compete with the other more meta tanks. I'll cover off the T34-85 and the Rudy, which can be extremely excellent in Tier 6. They don't have the speed, again, of the Cromwells. However, it does have an excellent gun, and it can survive a couple of shots and deflect a few off of it as well. So if you can, and you have an opportunity to pick up the Berlin package or one or two tanks from the Berlin package, the Rudy can be something that you'll consider. I think it's an excellent Tier 6 tank. While it's not considered the top meta, I think it can be an excellent choice, and I've seen many clans use them successfully. Now, as far as the mediums go, the preferred tank is going to be the Cromwell or the Cromwell B, or Bromwell. Ultimately, they have high mobility, high rate of fire, decent penetration. You may have to run a few gold rounds through to be able to win a few matches against OIs. But ultimately, T37s and Cromwells or Bromwells are going to be the tanks that you're going to see in most metas at Tier 6, other than the OI derp meta. And that is why the OI is so popular, because when you're running into Cromwells and T37s constantly, it's hard not to take a big tank that just makes them go boom in one shot. Arguments can be made for a lot of other tanks in the game. Ultimately, in organized gameplay, there are specific tanks that are going to shine because they fill roles specifically as teams need. So in Tier 6, you've got the T37 and the Type 64 as your primary lights, the Cromwell and the Cromwell B as the main mediums, with the Rudy and the T34-85 also being considered by a lot of upper clans. In the gray areas, you do have things like the ARL-44, the 5916 and other lights, and in the heavies you have for sure the OI, the KV85, the M6, 3601 as being competitive tanks. Again, while you can argue the points and merits of other tanks, like I said, in organized gameplay, listen to your callers, they'll tell you what they're looking for, and please be prepared to ready those up for them. I hope you guys have put together a list of what tanks you think you need, and hopefully you can get talking to your own clan commanders or prospective recruiters as to what they're actually looking for. However, this is a decent list to get started, and I hope to see you on the battlefield.